Age of Reason and Revival. There's no outline tonight because I did not have time to do it. I actually finished this thing about 20 minutes ago, outlining this. It was a long outline. And that was like a day and a half.
Just hit the highlight.
Well, I am. So we are in the Age of Reason and Revival. This is an age from 1648 to 1789. And this is where you find coming out of the Reformation. Richie was talking about the Renaissance, if you remember that. He mentions it here, he goes into it here. There's an age of thought. People are going back to the Greek and Roman cultures. They're looking at the old arts. So they're starting to think. And so reason is becoming one of these highlights. Men are starting to have logic and thinking. You saw that, in a lot of ways with Aquinas and all these different things. They're going towards this. The Renaissance took off on that. I mean, it took off on the before of the Industrial Revolution. After that, people were really motivated. Universities were springing up, so they were looking at reason. At the same time, you had a response to that, which was revival, because remember, we're looking at not just history, but when we look at history, remember this, it's his story. Culture shapes from a view of God. Actually, what I want to do in a couple of weeks, and I want to talk to you at the break, is about watching some old films that I have access to of Francis Schaeffer, because he is the best on how we look at worldview and history as his story and see it how it shapes the culture around us. What's that mean to me? It gives me relevance to read this stinking book, okay? Which was very good for the subject matter, but you really have to think, and he does a good job of bringing out points to think with, to know why this is going to help you shape the life you live. And see where all the influences come at you when you meet people from different faiths in Christianity, at different viewpoints, where they all came from. So, reason is rising, revival, he was going to meet the crisis in this. This was going to come from a place of just looking at dogmatism of reason to the idea of having experience. In other words, this is where we get the idea which we formulate, conversion experience. We're looking for the heart. They didn't look just at reason. They said, you know what, reason's one thing, but reason isn't God. This is where when you have reason, you get that stoic mentality. This is why you had a reversal when we get to modernism and we get to the ideas of the Romantic writers. Luca talks about that in Worldview, if you've ever taken worldview classes. But people wanted some emotion with life. You can't just live in a stoic life by itself. You need some kind of emotion. And so you look at this age rising up, and Christianity was looking for experience. They were looking for heart. And so they come at it coming out of the Reformation, which was dying. Remember, you're looking at the world, you look at the faith you have, and you're watching the Reformation, which had its peaks and all its tragedies in that, with wars and counter-reformations and tons of bloodshed with heresies. You're looking at these things, and you're looking at them seeing generations come, generations go, all these things becoming very docile and very mundane as far as church goes. And what happened was, the idea was, they're looking at this and saying, you know what, this can't be all there is to faith. Well, the Holy Spirit's always relevant in history, and what he brings in is the idea of bringing them back beyond even finding the foundations of salvation that Luther would give, the just shall live by faith, but going back to the real gospel. And men needed to be converted. They started reading the Bible's relevant. They started reading the stories of, the conversions of Philip with the Ethiopian, the gospel miracles, and all the passion that Christ had, the Passion Week, that there was passion in this whole story. And so they started going back to those things and seeing the born-again experience and conversion experiences as going back to the gospel. So there was a great thing. At the same time, you had that. So chapter 32 starts out with the aiming at the foundations, and it goes into a man named Ben Franklin starts out. And Franklin was brilliant. Nobody really knows if he believed or not. If you have some extra writings that weren't in the book, he was a real close friend of George Whitefield. He published George Whitefield's sermons. Went to hear George Whitefield preach, who was a great grace evangelist of the day that really is not stated here, but many historical books, they talk about Whitefield being one of the great influencers of the American Revolution because he united the colonies, because when he came over here, he traveled up and down the coast and preached in churches from Georgia all the way to New York and preached about Christ. And there's no king, but King Jesus was the cry of the revolution. So he had a tremendous influence. His side partner at the same school, they went to Oxford together, he was younger, was John Wesley. John Wesley came to America, but John Wesley influences the greater evangelical power of the day at this time was what? England. And many people think Wesley saved England from what happened in France in the what was it? The French Revolution. There you go. I'll get history going. But Franklin was a man that everybody respected. He was like a truly American man. He was a thinker. Again, he was a scientist. He was brilliant. He was like a Renaissance man, a man of the Enlightenment. You know, a lot of things I saw in this portion here, I really saw how you see many people go back to the American founding fathers as deists. And I see, really looking again at the age of the Enlightenment in France, how it influenced America, as it influenced France with the revolution. So he was like a deist kind of Enlightenment kind of guy, what he believed in. He definitely quoted the Bible. He definitely knew God was in the middle of all things. He definitely saw the Christian faith, but he never really made a confession of faith. But he had tremendous influence in all these things. So we see there, we come to the place of this age of reason and this Enlightenment. And this whole thing really started in France. So one of the things where this Enlightenment came about was through the man called Voltaire. He was a definite atheist, in one sense, believed in God, but deist mentality that if there was a God, you know what, he made the clock and he wound it but let it go. He brings this intellectual revolution, which really, the author pinpointed, it's the birth of secularism, where now what happens where the church, you saw, dominate the whole culture of state. I mean, you see things that the church did that really we wouldn't want done today. I don't want somebody to tell me how to worship. So the things that the state really, really did, from Catholicism to the Lutheran Church to the Church of England, to all these different church states that we would be opposed to, but what they did, they really influenced society to have a Christian vocabulary. I mean, people knew Christian thought. It permeated their culture. Secularism and the Enlightenment began to change that thing. Words get defined about truth, and we find out where we are today. We go away from those moorings into a secular society where Christianity isn't really the dominant force or the salt and light to the ideas we have today. So, reason has always been in the church. I mean, you see different people reasoning. You see, we talked about in even in the Middle Ages, you saw reason come about, universities questioning, answering. You definitely see it in the idea of the Reformation. But the Catholic Church always kept their authorities, as you saw, and they still did up to this time. They kept their authority in the church. The Protestant kept their authority in biblical authority, and then you had church states. But man basically looked at social issues and the world around him, pleasure and all those things. He looked at those things as the church's role wasn't really to provide like happiness and social concern in your life. What it was there for was basically to bring you to a place that you were really concerned with the next life. It really had like not this social implications in life about your marriage. It may baptize your kids, it may marry you, but you know what? It was more about the dogma of the church and the sacraments and the going and basically getting you ready for a holy life here. Why? To prepare you, because the real issue was the next life. It never came into where we see it as whole, that, you have this from the Gnostic, that this material life has meaning too. That God wants me to experience and build a testimony in this world that life here and heaven It's the same God. There's not this dualistic idea of, this down here, my family, the world is evil, and all the spiritual stuff is good. Church held control with that idea, but that idea was never, you really can't swallow that idea. And so the church basically stayed in those places of getting you ready. The Age of Reason rejected all these different authorities, the Catholic Church, the biblical idea of authority. And faith, was replaced by what? Reason. And the ultimate question here, and you could write this down as a question if you want for your quiz, is like, why not have both? Like, the idea was there's both. I can have reason and I can have faith, and faith is reasonable. They're the major concerns for the church. The primary concern was not now shifting in the Enlightenment. It wasn't about the next life, but it's about this life. And this is where we start getting a rise of everything is about, happiness and fulfillment in this life, in this world, that I want it now. I don't really care about the next life. I care about what I know right now. It's the rise of secularism, existentialism, like right now is the issue in my life. Why do I exist right now? And so reason started to bring to bear to say, we're going to reject all this because this is old code and we want to live life now. So this guy, Baron van Holbach, he was, a man arises from within himself, being a virtuous and rational man who cannot fail to become happy. So what this guy, this is one of the preachers of this idea, was the idea that man has to rise from within himself, becoming a virtuous and rational man who cannot fail to be happy. Why is that important? That throws out basically original sin, doesn't it? I mean, this is really going against church doctrine. Remember, we live in the church world right now, way more than we do today. These guys are growing up in Catholic France saying, in Germany, Lutheran Germany saying, it's about now, and I can rise within myself and be happy, which is the age we live in. Everybody wants to be happy. And everybody's on antidepressant pills, right? I didn't take mine today, so I'm a little depressed. So the Enlightenment's a rebirth. It's rooted in the Renaissance. It's after the Renaissance, or at the end of the Renaissance, like right around the Industrial Revolution, overlapping. But it's recovering those values from the Greek and Romans. They had this thing in the Reformation between Erasmus and Luther, and scholasticism and monasticism, and Erasmus was really on this side of reason. And he called it The Praise of Folly, was one of his works. So Luther was always about the idea of free will. Luther was all about the idea of original sin and the fall, that the will was enslaved. Erasmus believed that, we had a responsibility that you can come out of this, again, from within, the idea. These things were always floating around. In those days, it was more heretical. We're riding into a more liberal age where you're not going to get killed for what you believe. But we're still on the borderlines now, like we will kill you because you're a heretic. So these guys are coming out, kind of the opposite of the reformers. They're coming out with, doctrines of demons and enlightenment, if you want to say, from the church today. Going away completely from the Bible. So the Renaissance came in, and there was this different opinion. The Renaissance really took its secular view more in Southern Europe with Catholicism doctrine, because remember, in the North, when we have the idea of the Reformation, we have more biblical base. In the South, Southern Europe, from France and Catholicism, there wasn't that base. So it came out, the Renaissance looked again, basically at the idea of that man was improvable. There you have Da Vinci. They believed in God. There wasn't defining factors on God like the Reformation brought out. But the Renaissance, you have your Michelangelos, you have your Leonardo da Vinci. These are guys that thought, man, just give me time and, and I will evolve and I will produce this whole utopia, or whatever reason, I will figure this thing out. I mean, Leonardo da Vinci is incredible if you ever read some of his stuff or look at what he did. It's beyond even like, you're a master. Talk about a jack of all trades. This guy's a master at everything he does. From medicine to building, anything he does. He makes planes. I mean, then he does artwork. I mean, who is this guy? I mean, if there's an alien, it's Leonardo da Vinci. Crazy talented and crazy brilliant. And at the end of his life, he, a lot of writers say he was depressed at the end of his life, despondent, because, what, he was dying, and you can't escape death, No matter how much you want to become the Renaissance man, no matter how much you want to improve, as you're improving, you're slowly falling apart. Okay? This is the great idea of the gospel, is that, I might be falling apart, but the inward man's renewed day by day. I'm going to have something inside of me where the engine is going to run, even though I'm decrepit as can be. I can still see him. So, 1550 to 1650, we have all these religious conflicts. England goes through a war with Oliver Cromwell. He's notorious as a Puritan, pious kind of guy. He starts takes over the English government for a while and puts in his own court, disbands Parliament, and again, it is a Protestant kind of idea of a military takeover, just like the Catholic Church would. England has its day in that. Some people love Cromwell for what he did. Some people can't stand Cromwell, but whatever he did, he's a major church player in England. There's tremendous persecution still going on. The Huguenots are being chopped up in France. The 30-year war is going on in Germany with the Bohemians coming into Germany. And so a lot of this rises out of, reason. Like, they're looking at the church, and you can't blame them because, there's mass carnage going on. Your brother is just burned in the court square by the Jesuits, you know what I mean? For, some kind of inquisition. There's this kind of cry of, common decency. They just are killing people, women, children are being butchered. They're kind of like, what? Isn't there any decency? So anybody, you're looking at people despondent. The vast culture of people are just like pawns in the game. They're looking for any way out of this. This even goes all the way to, we're going to end this thing, in the socialism. Remember, feudalistic Europe, the serfs are being, trying to find some kind of liberation. Knowledge is increasing. There's a growing amount of them that are being able to be educated. This goes through Russia with social change, with the communist revolution. People want to get out of this thing. And the masses are suffering, and the only one really enjoying life are who? The noblemen and the rich, which are like a small percentage of society. And everyone else is held in check by what? The sword. So the age of reason comes in France, and people, without any Bible training like the Reformation, they're like, the church is crazy. The church is abusive. This isn't reasonable in my mind why I should be starving, and they say they love God and love me, the great commandment, and I'm like, they're living in, tremendous wealth off my back. So you see how this comes up in the order. Science, harmony come in. You have, in the Renaissance, Galileo. You have all these astrologers, Copernicus. They're looking at the world around them. They're looking at the skies. And then you have Isaac Newton, which he really put with the laws of gravity and the principles of natural philosophy and harmony. All of a sudden, they saw the world not as this thing. The stars are just up there painted on the ceiling. But they began to see the world as this gigantic machine. And that it had order. And now the earth wasn't the center of the universe. The earth wasn't flat anymore, like the church said in science. But that, the earth rotated around the sun. And Newton just brought his whole idea, this brilliance, about this giant machine. Newton did believe, and he wrote Christian works, Newton. So Newton was a tremendous person of prophecy. This is out of the book, but he had he was really into the end times. So these guys still believed in the starry host of heaven, that God had angels and stuff like that. He didn't throw it out. But this opened the whole idea to everyone else that what? What is this whole thing about? And can we find it? And can we reason it out? So there's this age of wonder, and people are beginning to read, so they're reading not just the Bible, they're reading Newton, they're reading science, and this age of reason is moving on. It attacks Augustine thinking of, The sinner needs to have grace of God. Attacks the role of the church and state. This power-driven idea of the church over the state, or vice versa, and how they, commingle basically to oppress people. People started to think that through. And so people are looking at a need of common sense. They're looking at sense more than the grace of God. Because, honestly, when you're in these places of poverty, this is the world they lived in the same way in third world countries, when we're going to get to social issues at the end. People are looking like, who can feed me? You want to sit there and talk about the grace of God, and I'm starving to death, or I'm in slavery, or everything's unjust around me. It's totally like, I don't want to hear about the grace of God. I want to hear about like some kind of relief for my tremendous woe in my life. And so reason, and they had the grace of God for so many centuries, reason was starting to answer those things. So, many still believed in the church. I mean, the church didn't die in this, but the church was still a cement factor. People still are always confronted about, like, I'm going to die. Even in New Age culture today, it's like people can't stand the idea of humanism by itself, because humanism basically teaches you that, you're nothing but a pile of dust and you're going to go to worms and that's it, have a nice life. Live for today, tomorrow you die. Why do I want to bother, working on overachievement, because there's really no one's going to remember me when I'm gone. Maybe they'll remember me like Voltaire for a couple centuries, but if life is nothing but eons, sooner or later you're going to forget Voltaire, because 5 more Voltaires are going to shoot up in history, right? So they're looking at still at the idea, I need to believe that there's something more than this. This idea is still in the hearts, because God's put eternity in our hearts. It's still there. But Europe was changing. Europe changed. England, truth. They wanted to harmonize this stuff. Reason and revelation was the idea of this, Reformation, which in England and Northern Europe, different than Southern Europe, which didn't have the Reformation. Nature was on the attack, and nature, in Scripture, Psalm 19, how to find God, do I find it through nature, do I find it through the Scripture? Confidence in reason was soaring in the idea of French. They saw the Scriptures, because they never really knew the Scriptures or studied them. They went more to like this whole thing that Catholicism is a superstition. I mean, France was the epitome of that, still is. It's the most atheistic culture in Europe. If you go to France and you talk about the Bible, you're looked at as like, are we for the Dark Ages or what? And Europe is mostly like this now, and even England. So we have the rise of the radicals was the next chapter in this idea of the progress, the age of progress here. This is the intellectual settings aside, revelation, miracles, virtue. They tore all the stuff out of the Bible, all miracles, whatever you want. The philosophies was a group. They weren't philosophers, but they were men of letters who basically, the students of society who analyzed evil and advocated reforms. Their goals were they looked at society. They went to society. They wanted to spread knowledge. They wanted to emancipate the human spirit. In other words, they wanted you to be happy. They went back to, to Roman culture. They went back to like, we don't want a God that's always laying trips on us and puts us down. We want a God that lifts us up and gives us what we want. So they sought after happiness. Deism became vogue, and this is where you see it hit the colonies, and you see like you go to our founding fathers in many ways. Because it was vogue, because it was something that was moving in society. They didn't have books, but they had culture. So they followed the French culture. Many were French. They followed these things. And deism came up, and they knew the abuses of the church. And deism came up. This was a bold new world here. And they saw the Enlightenment, and deism was the idea that basically, God made this thing, but you know what? He wound it up and let it go. Because it was so crazy, too. I can see where they get this. You got to put yourself back in time periods when you see history. Because the church was so crazy. Right? I mean, you can look at you can get the, whatever you view the Catholic Church today, you can look, well, that's crazy. It'd be way more crazy if they were killing half your family today. And then somebody wants to talk to you about church after you're recovering that, you're going, the church killed half my family, you need to get out of here. You got a brain in your head? I ain't going to church. Girl, what kind of church you have? So they were rising out of this stuff. And deism was like, hey, this world is so crazy. And you can look at it today like that. It's so crazy, does God have order in it? See, when you know the Bible, you can put together the ideas, and when you're taught well doctor, you can say, well, there's a God in this world. And He is crazy. Okay? And so we have a crazy world that God lets happen, and men love darkness rather than light. And so as they move away from God, salt and light do what? They diminish, and what happens? Evil does what? Waxes stronger. Dysfunction waxes stronger. Dysfunctional people breed more dysfunction. That's called more sin, and then the circle goes on. And so it gets back to the days of Sodom and Gomorrah and before the flood. And that's where we go without God. Because men, by themselves, do what's right in their own eyes, and what? Their thoughts are continuously evil without God. And demons come into those places. So deism rose up as the basically idea, because they weren't really atheists. They believed in God, but they didn't believe God had any real effect in life. Okay? So the whole thing was perfect. Crazy was perfect because God was a perfect God in a sense. They believed in God, and He made the watch, and He grounded it, and it's running. And so we don't need any interference and revelation, miracles. We don't need any of these things. Voltaire rises. He's the personified skeptic of skepticism. He moves this. He has disciples out destroying anything he can of Christendom. He is the author of the French Enlightenment. He's a relentless critic of Christianity, Catholic and Protestants, either one. He writes the French Encyclopedia, aimed to destroy, not to destroy religion, but to destroy if God did exist. Because he said, this is a statement he said, which I never knew. Because I always heard Voltaire was one of the founders of God is Dead, but he quoted a statement he wrote. He says, we need God because if God did not exist, man wouldn't invent one. So in other words, he had an idea still like of enlightenment that God had to exist. Even today, the humanists, like I say, have to invent some kind of spiritual level with New Age because it's unbearable to live in a world that has no meaning.
Yeah, I've heard that there's, if you don't believe in God, you believe in something that replaces God.
Sure, the higher state. Yeah, you have to have a higher state. There's always an upper story that you derive your essence from, or your being from, or your beliefs from. And if you have nothing, then you have to look towards yourself, and that's pretty depressing.
It's scary.
You know, that's what scares you. That's what's scary
for me than you.
So, they had a herald. Number one, the preeminence of science was one. They had a tremendous idea of tolerance, so they wanted to be tolerant of anything. They denounced superstition, and they expounded the merits of what? Deism. So it's a little bit like a New Age platform in the sense, if you think about it, because it's like the foundations of New Age deism. Because you have a God, but the God means really nothing. But He's there.
The spirit of the age.
Yeah, the spirit of the age comes. But they had an idea to demolish the church at the same time. I mean, they wanted to demolish Christianity.
I have a question. Do you think that during these times was there really any governmental interference in the church's affairs where they run completely autonomous? In other words, let's say there were, and you mentioned some of the things that happened to people, they were killed. Or in this day and age, in that case, the government would, if there was something committed, it was a crime, the government would be involved. But in that day and age, they just kind of left them alone and said, well, that's how they do things, and they railed against it, but never really stepped in. And
the church actually, like you missed a lot of the earlier classes, but the church actually, the Catholic Church especially, had this doctrine that they wouldn't shed blood. So what they did is the Inquisition, the Jesuits were raised up basically to come after a lot of the heresies that were going on from the Reformation, and they would go in and they would basically torture you, but they wouldn't shed blood. But then if you were found as a heretic, they would give you over to the state that worshiped, that worked with the church, and have you burned. But they wouldn't shed your blood, that's why they burned you. And, but they'd give it to the state so to keep their hands clean as church people. So they worked with the state, and that fear was definitely throughout the Catholic world. In the Protestant world, there became quicker tolerance of different beliefs. And feudalism had different beliefs. Some of the in the last thing through the Reformation, some of them gave tolerance to different lords that you can have, like a Catholic feudal system, like right there, and a Protestant one right here, and they tolerate you. So denominationalism became more tolerant. People were able to begin, right in the rise of our First Amendment rights. You can believe what you want. You have that right. So this is all like evolving, you know. 5 of this was Christianity on trial. That it was a plot to turn the earth over to the oppressive powers of priestly caste, a scheme to exploit the ignorant. This stuff goes on from the Enlightenment into communism. Voltaire liked to refer to Christianity as an infamous thing. It pointed to the thousands of victims of Christian intolerance. So we have that today. People look at the Crusades, right? And they will whack you. Well, you're a Christian. The Crusades, it's on your head. They'll come at you with anything. They weren't reason to what they wanted to bring it to fight what they wanted to bring. They didn't bring reason through the conclusions of, that's not what Jesus taught, So a lot of people make judgments on the Bible and Christianity, but they never really read the Bible. They just look at the abuses and judge the Bible. But the people doing the abuses aren't following the Bible, so you can't blame Christ for the abuses. But see, we know that today because I've been taught that. I didn't think that through, but I understand thinking is very important now and in all ages. A lot of this gives you the ability to reason, see the reasons why they did things. That's why I think history is so important of a cultural art that people put on the shelf like it's old and dusty, but without knowing it, again, you're due to repeat it. So he judged all this, and he had the right to judge it. I mean, it was judged, but you can't judge Christianity and Christ by this. Truth was the cry by which reason, truth was the cry, but reason, but through the scriptures, the true philosophy that would come, that condemn the church's abuses with them. So that's what I was just saying. In other words, the abuses, the Bible condemns those abuses unreasonable. So this is all nonsense. Diderot was his disciple, Voltaire's disciple. He attacked miracles and, where do you stop? He just said, basically, if you believe in miracles, what else do you believe in? The tooth fairy, where do you stop? So we believe that, through science and reason, there are no miracles, because once you start saying miracles, the whole pot's open to outside of reason. And we want to confine God in a box, and we want to be reasonable about it. And honestly, in our box, we'd rather not have God at all, because then we can do what we want. So number 6 was the futility of an empty conscience. And in this idea, France, in the Catholics, church tries to use traditional methods to stop Voltaire and deism, but they're unable. In other words, they tried to stop it by force, but it was too spread. They tried to convert people, but nobody wanted to hear it. I mean, this had built up through generations, and the Renaissance and these things, basically people were fed up, and the French were fed up with this thing. England was more successful because England had, again, the Reformation, so people had the Bible, and people could read the Bible. Joseph Butler was one of the guys he named. His analogy, I can't say the word.
Analogous?
Analogy, thank you. Of religion saved fundamentalism for thinking people. So he began to think with this idea. Nature has enigmas and perplexities. Reason can't answer all the mysteries of life. He looked at what they were saying as reasons. He goes, most of the things you're saying you can't figure out, but you're going to tell me your reason's your God. And so you have faith too. The Bible's no different than that. You know what? It is reasonable, and miracles and these things, just because you can't figure them out doesn't make them not true. Because nature has all these. And you're saying nature's true, but you can't figure it out. So he used basically circular reasoning back around him and wrote more than that even, but he answered enough of the idea with the Bible that in England people didn't go the way that Voltaire went. Plus the English didn't like the French anyway, so. It's always been a war there. Right? So unanswered. So it had no, deism in England had no sound answers to protect it. But the damage is done. Secularism and culture, educate politics, separate, all these things begin to influence the way people think. In other words, these thoughts are put into people's minds, even if you believe it. So they start to do their influence to the culture all through Europe. But faith goes back, to home and heart. This is where they want to put it. I know it's where it really makes its individual statement, but they wanted that they basically say, you know what, cool, man, you can believe what you believe, but you know what, keep it in your home and your heart. That's a rise of another whole out of balance position, which Schaeffer gets into with the idea of personal peace and affluence. In other words, just keep everything at home, and just keep it in your own heart, and keep it in your own family. It's where you start getting the ideas of, let's not talk about politics, let's not talk about religion. Let's not talk about anything that matters. Let's just, keep it to yourself. All right? Have a nice life. Don't call me, I'll call you. Bye. Right? 33, he started the idea of the heart and its reasons, and he talks about Pascal. Pascal's a great, brilliant Frenchman. For you Frenchmen here, he is the father of hydraulics and the calculator for you accountants and the idea of the modern barometer. Isn't that right? So I have read, so I have heard. Brilliant man, gets converted in this age of reason. And all his life in the beginning of the book, he carried, I heard Robert Zacharias, he carried in his jacket, and he would change it from jacket to jacket, his conversion experience next to his heart. He was the guy that basically went back into this pious movement of the idea of experience. He didn't just know about the grace of God, he experienced the grace of God. This is where Christianity has to go to be doing. It can't just be knowing, it has to be experiencing. And it starts with experiencing. Whatever makes my experience in doing after that starts with the first cause, which is the experience that God gives into my life. After that experience, everything's open to me to experience God doing new things in my life. But without that experience, it all becomes dead works. So he has that. He rises the new movement called Pietism. It's not a church creed. The Reformation established church creeds. Luther was brilliant with salvation through grace and faith. Doctrines came out. These things were brilliant, but you know what? This wasn't a church creed, but this was an experience. In other words, he's saying, you know what? It needs to be more than that. Catholic, he was. Lutheran, it didn't matter. You had to experience this whole thing. He appeals, the first point this was appeals to cheap grace. So this is the beginning of that chapter or that portion in the book, but the Jesuit talks about the Jesuit in the book, how they came at this whole thing, and they were looking in reason faces. We talked a little bit about that. But the Jesuit, and Pascal was at this time, they were living in a place that was relevant to me because they were living in basically lying for the common good. In other words, they lived lifestyles contrary to the Bible, but their mentality was we can lie, almost like lying to the devil, and we're doing this for a greater good. They also developed ideas of penance, where confession became frequent. So what happens with that? I sin frequent, I what? Confess frequent, and I'm fine. So I sin and I confess. I sin and I confess. And so everything's all good. And you know what? This didn't really play well in Peoria. Jansen came out, this idea of Jansen, which was an attack against this by this man, Jansen. He came to Paris. His disciple was Jacqueline Arnaud. And they leveled guns at the Jesuits. I mean, this is at the Catholic Church. They get kicked out of there. But they looked at this doctrine of frequent confession and frequent sinning, and basically they said this is insane. This can't happen. The Jesuits called for the Pope to come in and make some kind of declaring. The Pope says, you know what, these guys are heretics. Basically, they have to get out of Dodge, and they get out. The Pope just calls them Calvinists in Catholic garb. So they're, in other words, the Reformation coming down into the Catholic Church, and you need to leave the Jesuits alone because they're under me, and that's it. I'm the authority because I'm the Catholic Church, and that's it. Pascal comes to the defense of all this, and he holds it at bay in France because now Pascal is at 27 years old, he's brilliant. He's like Da Vinci. He's like the Renaissance Enlightenment man, and yet he has a belief in God. Until he holds them at bay, he holds them basically from killing these guys, these Jansenites, because he takes their side for popular opinion. But as soon as he dies, they come after him, and then they get out of Dodge. But Pascal and the Jansenites, whatever you want to say, they pen 18 letters, provincial letters exposing Jesuit heresy. So they come against this whole Catholic sect down there. And this helps fuel, the Enlightenment too, because though they may not agree with his analysis of God, they respect Pascal. And when your enemy, you can give your enemy any weapon to attack his enemy, which is the Catholic Church. My enemy becomes your enemy. So the Enlightenment, all these things mixed together. You know what I'm saying? So the more you expose the abuses with reason and experience, you're gonna come against those. And if the guy doesn't believe in God, like Voltaire, then you know what? Thank you, Pascal. I know you have a deep belief in God, but thank you for just destroying my enemy, because my enemy really is your enemy too. By the way, you're my enemy too, because you believe in God, but that's for another day. The bigger enemy is the Catholic Church here in southern Europe. So man becomes the glory of God, basically the glory of himself. And the Enlightenment begins to see the idea of who's going to unravel all the confusion of this thing, that we can do it ourselves. But the pious are about the heart. And this is one quote I really loved in the book. It says, "The heart has reasons which reason does not know." I thought that was a great quote. The heart, in other words, the beginning of the pietist movement of personal salvation, personal experience, which we take off on in every church service, in everything we preach the gospel, attacking reason. They would look at experience and emotional, whatever. But their defense was a statement: the heart has reasons which reason does not know. In other words, this is an area that's above another whole sect of basically the internal metaphysics of my life, that my mind can't really dominate my emotions as far as understanding all the feelings there are in life. Can my mind govern those things? But sometimes the emotions take me beyond my mind, don't they? There you got the transcendental, right? I'm carried away with Christ. It's not reasonable, but it's reasonable by faith, isn't it? And that's an experience beyond, isn't it? And so they're going back into this. Yes, there's an experience of a born-again reality. And again, Europeans using heart, the church is losing heart. Catholics and Protestants have no heart. So God's always been faithful in generations to rise up something for the tide, hasn't he? I mean, you can see history, and all of a sudden God rises up what the church needs. It's a rebirth of what? Passionate Christianity. We need it now. So 16th, 17th century reason alone dictated attendance to the state church, and the sacraments mark of a good Christian. So these were just like where it had no heart in the 17th century. The idea was basically church had become what it is today in so much of America. It's become just, you're a good Christian. You just go to church, You pet your dog, you don't kick your dog, right? Take care of your family, you go to work, you're a good Christian. You have all the grace of God. There's no surrender to the born-again experience. There's no salvation experience. Just as Jainism opposed the cheap faith of the Jesuits, Pietism challenges the nominal faith, mainly where it really hit the nominal faith, because they were busy with the Enlightenment in the South. But Pietism basically hit the nominal faith of German Lutherans throughout Central Europe. I mean, it just became a form of godliness denied the power of, and Pietism came back in as a definite tweak to this kind of lifestyle. And it was twofold. It basically talked about the idea of personal faith in a believer's heart. And it definitely had the movement also from a state church to a fellowship of those who had a living faith in God. So it was twofold. It basically went now into personal faith was first in my heart. In other words, churches have to be made up of people that come together, not by a state church, not by a Lutheran church, not by a Church of England, not by a Catholic church, but it has to come from individuals that have this burning heart of faith from salvation, and they come together in a group with a living faith of that heart to basically worship and grow in the Lord Jesus Christ and to propagate the gospel. Okay? The second part of this was soul's return to life. And Philip Spencer was a Frankfurt Awakening preacher. He preached on the Sermon on the Mount and away with state church text. In other words, he got rid of the texts that they gave him. How many have you ever been to like a... I grew up in a Lutheran church. They give you what to preach on every week.
Yes.
Okay? Not saying you don't have to study anything,
It's the text.
but they just give you your text as what you're supposed to preach on every week. Spencer kind of was the guy that they threw them out the window. So that was kind of revolutionary to throw them out the window. Catholic Church the same way. They give you what day it is, what liturgy it is. But he went back to the old-fashioned Bible of repentance and discipleship. And he started a discipleship meeting, which was radical. He met and was dedicated to meet believers in his house twice a week. And he called the Gathering of the Pious. So the name Gathering of the Pious becomes the basically foundation of what? The Pietist movement. Pietist is born. Discipleship, rebirth. Spencer, Frank, what they teach in, and Spencer, he teaches in universities. Again, the Pietist movement, captaining with Pascal of Salvation Experience. They're going back to the gospel. The later part of this whole Pietist movement in 1770 to 1760 is a man called Count Zinzendorf. Zinzendorf was a noble family in Moravia, Bohemian. Brethren basically migrated. His father was a thinker of basically churches and on the edge of this whole idea and looked for trying to enter into this Pietist movement. But what they did is this Bohemian Brethren, remember the Bohemian Brethren were the ones that were in Prague during the Middle Ages and the Reformation. They came out. They were persecuted in the 30-Year War. They survived out of Hus, out of Prague, in Czechoslovakia. They basically are fleeing persecution. They're basically tired of the 30-Year War. And news spreads. They hear about, like, Zinzendorf and the family. And they start Herrnhut, which is a tremendous, basically, after Reformation, in this whole time period, which I love this time period, foundation of a Christian community. In other words, with the wealth they had, they established businesses, trades, and they're building a Christian world in the middle of Moravia. And these people are flooding to them, hearing that there's protection there because this guy's a nobleman. And Lutheran churches all around them, so you have, this denominational thing moving here, starting to move. And so they start this successful community. And Zinzendorf's just a great guy, man. He's very tolerant, he's very open, but he's all about Christ. And he's all about a community of Christians and a real fellowship of saints. And this whole idea of being protected from the world. You know, he's not an isolationist. You could say, well, then he's like a, what do we have here? Amish person or a Mennonite. Whatever. You go and you want to get out in the boondocks and you just want to, be isolated from the world. No, he sends everybody all over the place into the world. He has a missionary awakening that basically comes before William Carey, who's the father. We get the father of modern missions, but he basically has this whole explosion of unity in this community, and that they should go into all the world. So he's the first Protestant mission movement, really. They go to America, South, Greenland, Africa. I mean, you can go to the islands. I've been to the islands and seen some of their churches that they built. They're in ruins now. But these guys went over, and they went to slaves. They didn't go even to the British colonials who were keeping the slaves. I mean, some of these guys became slaves to minister to the slaves. They're crazy in love with God. So they have a tremendous effect, in American missions and in history for what they did and their influence. Zinzendorf said that, it was all about Christ. If you read some of the stories in his books, they had their woes. He went away Zinzendorf just said to me, he actually went to the colonies himself on a boat. So he didn't ask you to do something he didn't do. He actually went himself. And he had problems when he came back, and the devil gets in, and they had emotionalism in Hoover Hunt, Herta Hunt, whatever it was. But his whole thing was, it's all about Christ. It's he, none but he. Part 3 of this was a view from a rear view mirror, looking at this whole thing of the Enlightenment and Pietism. He revived care of the soul, the people. Preaching and pastoral visitation became up in this Pietist movement. Music and spiritual laity for a revived church basically came about in this movement. The gospel began to be preached. The dominant theme of the Pietist movement was regeneration. The Moravians, all this. It wasn't just a doctrine, but it was an experience. It wasn't just like, hey, I'm going to teach you the doctrine of regeneration. No, are you regenerated? Are you regenerating? Are you experiencing it in your life? Something going on in you. So that was the dominant thing they had. And it was in the heart of Christian doctrine, becoming Christian reality, which is where the church always has to go. Not in the letter of the law, not even in church history. At the end of this class, it's like, do you see you are church history? And do you have a place in it? Would somebody be writing in heaven a story of, here's the story of Dave Trumbull in 2013. You have a place in the book of Acts. And that early book of Acts still goes on today. And this is the book of books of where it's gone. It's a bigger book about these guys in heaven that maybe we could read someday. But we have the fountain here of modern revivals, the evangelical spirit. It inherited 2 traits. Number 1, emotion played so large a part against reason. Basically it had emotion coming into play in this whole thing, which reason endangered the whole thing. Because reason brings you back into a Stoic idea, if you just go to reason. And I know a lot of you are Stoics in here, but we need to be emotional too. We have passion. Passion. Jesus wept, the shortest book, verse in the Bible, right? He had passion. Wasn't a drama queen, but he had passion. It assumed an institutional church. It didn't make any attacks on the units, but basically it had this rebirth of spiritual life in smaller groups. So you have like a birth of somewhat small groups. The Pietists didn't go against the churches. They just saw themselves part of the church, and they wanted to worship God and have this experience and be around people who had it. It could be like born-again Catholics in a church, a movement, It could be anything. We're not going to destroy the Catholic Church, but you know what? We're going to live like Christians in the Catholic Church. Could be in the Lutheran Church. Could be in any church. that people start to experience God and start getting excited about that. They were people that started to get excited about God and experience Christ saving them. And that was huge. 34, we have a brand of the burning. I love these guys. Richie was wrong when he said I didn't wonder. I'd rather these guys than the Reformation. Wesley and the Moravians, eternal security. Wesley meets the Moravian. The brand plucked out of the fire speaks of Wesley's experience when he was a young boy. He was in a religious family of the day, Anglican, and basically he is in a building at the age of very young, I don't know, 12 maybe, and he's a rectory that's burning down, and he's on the second floor, and they see him in the window, and these guys one guy stands on somebody's shoulders, and they rescue him. From that day on, he called himself a brand plucked from the fire. It's one of those things that you say, I shouldn't be alive, but somehow for the grace of God, God spared me. And that was his experience. He goes, I should be dead. I don't know why I'm alive. But somehow I got out of this burning building. And I live here for a purpose. A lot of us have experiences like that. Hey, you know what? I should be dead. Somehow God has a purpose for my life. We've all met people like that. Maybe we are those people. But Wesley basically starts the Holiness Club. I'm going to paraphrase this for time. He starts a Holiness Club in Oxford through this experience. He goes and he really sees that the way of Christianity is through discipline and holiness and practicing Christianity. And so he understands that work and effort will get it done. So he's about this whole holiness movement and disciplining himself and his weaknesses and all these things in his self-effort. And he gets this tremendous group going. These guys are amazing. We had Whitfield's in this. His brother Charles Wesley's in it, who writes so many hymns. Some we sing today. I mean, these guys are like the pack of pack. And of course, they're put down in the college because they're the holiness people, like they would in any college today. So the same intolerance, that we have today in society, they had back then. But Wesley basically when he graduates, he takes a call to the New World. Everybody's going west to the New World. He takes a call to a church in Georgia. He goes there. He's a young man. Basically on his way, this is how you see Christianity connect these guys. He's on a ship, and the ship's going down basically. The masks tore off, right? The ship. I mean, he's puking. He knows all this doctrine, but he's scared stiff to die. He believes in eternal security, but he's like, my God, I'm going to die. And he looks across the ship, and there's these guys from the Moravian church, from Luna Hut, and they're going to Georgia, or it's the colonies too. And they're singing praises, hallelujah. He looks at them and goes, something's, like anything's basic reason. Something's wrong with me and my faith. And something's very right with their faith. And he meets with them. He goes, aren't you afraid to die? And they're like, no, I'm not afraid to die. We're Christians. Oh, so am I. I just wet my pants. Threw up. And, he was intrigued by the Moravians and, left the boat, went to his calling. It was a total disaster. Got hooked up with some girl, and that whole thing fell apart, and she married his friend, and basically tried to retaliate, or not give her communion. It became a nightmare. He leaves the colony, he goes back to America, he's despondent. But he remembers the Moravians. Actually goes visit Herna Hut, and he goes to visit them, he sees them, and he is definitely impressed by them, but he doesn't like anything. He goes someplace, I love this, but I don't like that and that. He looks at them, and they thought they, kind of worship Count Zinzendorf, and, a lot of these guys owed their life to him, so they had codependencies to him like anybody would. So, yeah, I know, we've been there. So, anyway, he goes back and he loves you, but he finds Christ is the bottom line of the story. And the Moravians are impetus for that. He has the pietist experience, and that changes his whole life. So, we have number one chapter in this after Wesley's experience of the evangelical awakening, and in three areas. It had the German pietist movement in England, it had the Methodists, and in America it had the Great Awakening. So three things. And 1730 was the evangelical explosion, the apostolic concern to preach the gospel to the unconverted. We had revivals, Jonathan Edwards, Whitfield, Wesley, Ralph Erskine in Scotland, Hal Harris in Wales. These guys begin to really just go open-air preaching with the gospel, indoor preaching with the gospel, and the Holy Spirit began to move. It was rooted in Puritanism, controlling passion of salvation, and the lost. The preaching of the gospel with passion. England, reason had taken the heart of the gospel. Latitudinarian, I can't even say it, Latitudinarians, that was the name of the sect. Conduct generous, human, tolerant, and avoid bigotry and fanaticism. So these were groups that sprang up in England with reason. The Latitudinarians, they were basically looking to be good people. They wanted to be humanists, they wanted to be tolerant, they didn't want bigotry, they didn't want fanaticism. But this hit the church in England, and they had no heart though, they had no enthusiasm. So there was no life of God in their walk. Two of this is the little giant John Wesley. He's one of my favorite people in church history. I mean, comes from a family of 19 children. His mother, bringing the Methodist idea, she took time for every one of those 19 children weekly to teach them the Bible personally. I mean, you had to do, the idea is you had to have a methodology to do that with 19 of them. And she's got some of the greatest church rockers in history with 19. I mean, you think you had probably 5 over there, it'd be 19. Imagine that. That's a woman.
And she had no robots to do the dishes.
No, she didn't. And they weren't that wealthy. I mean, they had money compared to the common, downtrodden, but they weren't what they call high-to-do, wealthy family. 6 years old it was when he was saved from that burning, lamp brought from the fire. He did something I thought was really good. I'm going to start doing it, but I might have enough paper to write it on. He saw the impossibility of being a half-Christian. He goes, you have to be a whole Christian. He saw half-Christian. And so what he did is he began to look at his life and he categorized his weaknesses and established rules to overcome them. It's part of the methodology that he incorporated in his life. See, he wrote down all his weaknesses. And he said, you know what? I'm going to establish rules to help overcome these things. This was the Methodist Holiness Club beginning. Again, he had his idea with the Moravians, and he went to England. Again, he would have idealistic experiences, but he had all this experience, he gets converted. Part 4 of this whole portion was to the fields and to the world. The preaching of Whitfield, Wesley in Bristol, New England experience. Basically, Whitfield starts as Whitfield's the better preacher of the two. Whitfield had a golden voice. He's one of the church's greatest preachers, with Spurgeon. But he basically gets called to go to Bristol and preach. He preaches, and if you never did open air preaching, it's not the most easy thing to do. I mean, insecurity and all that come upon you, and the devil's right there. But he preaches to 3,000 in Bristol, and God begins to give him this ministry of open air preaching. So he was the one who said, "The world is my parish." The preaching of faith. This was the idea: preaching of faith till all others have it, and now his own faith was confirmed by theirs. In other words, I'm going to preach faith that other people have it, and my confirmation that I have it is that you have it now. It's like I have fire. I'm going to preach until I have fire, and I'm going to pass it on to you, and I'm going to preach fire to you. And my confirmation that I have it is that you got it. I had something to give you, and it's reflected back in you. And so this is the kind of idea that they had in their open-air preaching. So churches refuse it. Modern-day churches, the Anglican Church, his own father's church, and Epworth Church, refused to let him in the building. The classic stand of Wesley's, he preaches on his father's tombstone. This is another place in England to preach in an organized church, and hundreds here preach. Wesley was an Arminianist versus the idea of Whitfield was a Calvinist, and they had a, even though they were friends, they chose to disagree, but they had a little feud for a large part of their life. But I know at the end of Whitfield's life, he said that his work was a work of sand compared to Wesley's, because Wesley's work endured for a century until really, to this age. But Wesley really was a propagator and builder of churches and mover, even more than Whitfield, though they were both great men. He preached over 40,000 sermons in his life. He wrote over 250,000 miles. He averaged 5,000 miles a year, which is incredible.
On a horse.
On a horse, Sermon on the Mount. And he prepared his messages by riding a horse. I mean, I couldn't ride a horse a mile, let alone 250,000 miles. My God, I can't even think of what it'd be like. And he's an old man going through cold England, in these places, in all seasons. Amazing, amazing, unparalleled as far as endurance in the gospel and passion in the history of the church. I mean, no one, even Paul the Apostle may mirror that, but even the endurance for all those years. His legacy stimulated missions overseas. He elevated the poor, and he elevated social concerns. He went to people nobody went to. He went to Wales. He went to these places that the upper class, the upper churches didn't go to, nor were people going to them. But he went to the coal mines in Wales, and he preached, and to all parts of England. Unbelievable. 35 chapter was a new order of the ages, e pluribus unum. Out of many, God has smiled on our undertaking. 1776, a new order of the ages. You guys can take a break.